Hello, beautiful ladies, and welcome back to Wamen Hour, where I'm joined once again by Charlotte, aka Call of the Shield Maiden. Thanks so much for coming back.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
And viewers will remember Charlotte from the episode a few weeks back called Are Wamen Welcome on the Right, which was a very interesting episode, very well received. And you had a lot of really interesting things to say, and a surprisingly healthy, productive conversation took place in the comments without any horrible toxicity that we were complaining
Nothing too
about in the.
spicy. Yeah.
So yeah, thanks so much for coming on to talk about that. Very much needed at the time, I think, and yeah, had an interesting conversation. So off the back of that, I brought you back because you mentioned being, is it Amish or Mennonite? Let's just get that off the bat.
Well, to be perfectly technical, it's Mennonite. But I've always said Amish because a lot of people don't know what a
People don't
Mennonite
know.
is, and it's the same like Christian theology behind it.
Okay, well, starting from wherever you think, either autobiographically, you could talk about your own experience or describe what Amish is, what is Amish, Mennonite, what are the differences, wherever you think is a logical place to start. Why don't you just tell us all about it?
Well, I can start back at the Reformation. But essentially, I think it was in Switzerland where the Reformation started. And there was, Martin Luther doing his thing and a bunch of other, I think you call them all Protestants, right? There were a lot of them, and they were wanting to still have like state religion. They were wanting to reform the existing church and not break away from it. But I guess the religious ancestors of Amish Mennonites, all that, they didn't want to. Basically, they didn't think like who gives the church authority? It's God, not the church. So, and they didn't want to go on with infant baptism because one of the big ideas behind they're called Anabaptist rebaptizers because they want you get baptized on confession of faith when you're old enough to be accountable. So they would rebaptize people who'd been christened as infants into the state religion. So basically they tried to get back to the early church, so whatever the apostles were up to after Jesus died. So they really want to get back to that kind of simplicity while other Protestants were still into state religions and that kind of thing. So that's kind of where it started. And then as time went on, the Hutterites, I think the man's name was Jacob Hutter, and he came up with the idea that the Christians should live as the disciples in a common purse, sharing everything, and that's the Hutterites. And then I think his name is Jacob again, Jacob Ammon. I don't know if I'm saying that right, but he's kind of the religious ancestor of the Amish. And then Menno Simons was very influential in the Mennonites. So that's kind of how that came about. And then because every single, whether it was Catholic or Protestant, were killing, persecuting these Anabaptists, that's why there's kind of an American religion, because they all just had the opportunity to go to America, so they just went. So there are a few Mennonite types still left in Europe, but just because of that persecution, they all just went over to America, and that's why it's kind of an American religion. So that's like the history of the church. As for me personally, my parents were religious. I think my mother was baptized. She might have been christened as a child, but she was baptized into a Baptist as a young adult, and I think she just wanted more, because I know, like back when she was young, I think that was in the early 80s. Because I know back then churches, it was probably the start of churches going woke. So she just,
Yeah, well, how far back do you want to go? It's like every generation has its own woke, and
yeah,
Martin Luther was the original
true.
heretic.
Yes. Yeah, so she just wanted more than the Baptists. And I think, I don't remember how she came across Mennonites specifically. So back then, the first people who came out to Australia were called Beachy Amish. They're a very conservative sect. They live like a Mennonite, so they drive cars and stuff, even though they have the name Beachy Amish.
So how did they get to Australia? Were they fleeing something, or they were going there for opportunities, or they sort of sprang up in Australia?
So these people do a lot of missionary work, because one of the things the early church fathers did, the disciples, is go out and preach the word.
Okay.
They've gone to South America. There's a whole bunch of Mennonites in Africa, so they come to Australia. I think there's a lot of them in India as well, or at
So
least, and Philippines.
did they get to England? Are there people living here who would
So
communities here?
one of the young women I knew when I was last involved with the Mennonites in Tasmania, she's actually here in England. Haven't spoken to her for years. I don't know where she is or what she's doing, but I know she's here in England. So they are around, and I believe there are a few. I think they're Bruderhofs, so that's a slightly different brand of Hutterite. But I know there's a community like that here in England. So they are. There's not a lot around. Like, I think the worldwide population of Mennonites is only 1 million, so very low speaking worldwide. But there's a few of them here and there in other countries outside of the US.
So I've got loads of questions, but just to focus on the lifestyle to begin with, I think the Amish idea, going back to like the Weird Al song Amish Paradise, that kind of the meme around what Amish is, it sort of not using any modern technology at all. No, what is it? No electricity. No, there's like a sort of arbitrary cutoff where they don't have any industrial revolution kind of technology, no engines, no steam power, everything's man and horse powered, and it's all kind of agricultural. And like
Yeah.
economically, are they selling things outside the community, or is it completely insular?
I think they do. They do sell stuff outside of the community, because if you would go to the US, you can go to a plain community and there's a bakery there, or they will. I remember reading a book and it was about Amish people they had a lot of like stories of people with cerebral palsy or dwarfism. It was just a collection of these people's life stories when they had these different disabilities. And that was full of them selling things and working with outsiders. I mean, they would more have their own business, but there was, they might, run not run a factory, more like a workshop. They don't do like factory level stuff, but you're having a workshop where you sell and make leather wallets, or you have a bakery where you sell baked
Yeah,
goods.
so it
Or
becomes kind of like a novelty for tourists to buy.
yeah,
Oh, you can have an Amish made wallet.
yeah.
To me, that kind of spoils the idea of it. Where I would imagine the idea is that everyone's involved in just subsistence farming, crafting. There's a blacksmith making horseshoes for the horses, and the horses are pulling the plows, and the plows are harvest. They're working on fields where food is grown for the community. I imagine if they tried to sell that crop outside, it may not be competitive with other sort of large volume manufacturers, and may not meet all of the safety standards and that sort of thing. But they pay tax, in America, for instance, do they pay taxes to the American government with their whatever income they do make?
As far as I'm aware, yes, unless the US government has some kind of religious exemption when they can do their taxes and claim it under that. But yeah, I don't know all the details with the tax system in the US.
Okay. Uh, I guess I'm also interested in how much, whether it's Australia or America or wherever it is, how much does the community have to abide by the law and standards and of the country that it exists in? How much do they have their own sort of parallel system of law? Do they have their own courts? hospitals, or what's the system?
So they believe in living simply. So going ahead and getting a higher education by going to uni, that's not something that most of them would allow to happen. They wouldn't send their kids off to uni at all. As for courts, no, they don't. They don't. They're not going to set up their own court either.
So if a crime happens, they get the proper authorities, the higher authorities involved, or crimes just don't happen ever.
What type of crime are we speaking of?
Well, you tell me. I mean, if I said, Jacob's stolen my plow, or he broke my plow without asking, without asking me to use it or something.
But if you were in a family and you took your siblings' plow or broke it, like you wouldn't rush to the police straight away.
Well, some
You
people
would
do, but
you
yeah.
would go tell your mother, and your mother would make him give it back. With these communities, because they're small, there's not thousands of people. There might not even be 100. So a lot of this stuff can be sorted out within the community, and I think in some of cases, because everyone knows what's happening, you're not going to feel inclined to do some crimes
Mm.
because everyone's going to know it's you. You have to live with these people. These are your family.
Well, that leads me to my subsequent question, which is, if it's a religious community and there are obviously religious rules, if not actual laws, then who decides those rules? Who interprets the Bible? Like whatever the founding text of these communities is. There must be some kind of leader or council or someone who's in charge of making decisions for the whole community.
So their whole, like, back to the Reformation's always been the early church. What did Jesus and his disciples do? So that's kind of when they come across a problem. That's kind of where they're coming from. So there are religious texts like Menno Simons wrote like books and things like that, which they would read and so on. But it's really the Bible that they go by.
Well, we
And
know how many interpretations there are of scripture, so, so there must be someone who's. I guess even within a religious community, you do have religious leaders. You have a person who is I don't know, you call it a priest or a minister.
so they would have, I know with Mennonites, they have a bishop who is kind of oversees a few churches. Then each individual church has a deacon, it's about 3 or 4 ministers. So there is a number of people who are leading the church.
Mm. And are they appointed, elected? How do you, if you wanted to be one, would they let a woman do it? I'm just.
So women can't even vote to elect the next minister. Men do that.
Okay.
So you literally go to church and you're sitting on the woman's side of church because you can't sit near the men,
Mm.
and they will go ahead and vote who they want. It's anonymous voting. I think they get down to a few different people, candidates, and then
Mm.
they will place a slip of paper in one hymn book or in a Bible. So there's 2 identical books. One has a slip of paper, one doesn't, and each man will just go up and pick a book, and whoever happens to have a slip of paper, he's the one that gets ordained because they believe God will make sure the right man gets the book.
Oh, okay. I thought that this was like a voting thing, but this is just so they vote to get it down to a few guys, and then God chooses the actual one who gets elected.
So the voting ceremony, not a ceremony. So when I saw them voting, they were voting who it was that was going to be in charge of the school for that year. So they needed a few different people to run the school, doing different jobs. So there was a few different names that everyone seemed to be talking about, and they had voting putting forward someone's name, and then they chose that person to run the school based on who had the most who the most people wanted. I've never actually been in a ceremony where they were choosing the minister, but I've certainly read about it. And yeah, it appears that they will have the identical books. They will only have 2 or 3 candidates. It's not 10 of them, very
Yeah.
few. And yeah, they think
Wow.
God will give you the right book.
Okay. And have you been aware of people being ejected or rejected, or I suppose people voluntarily leave, such as yourself? Or can you tell us about that? How, if you don't mind talking about your personal experience, did you leave by choice, or were you too radical and had to be ejected?
So because I was never fully a part of a lot of these religious groups, I was never a member of a church. So they were starting their church in Tasmania,
Mm.
and
These sort of what's the word I'm looking for? Missionaries
yeah, so
from
the whole
America.
bunch of them, yeah, a whole bunch of them came to Tasmania to start their religious thing, and me and my sisters, we were feeling we weren't really being fully accepted by them because they're very American and they're very much a part of a clique. So they've been in their Mennonite communities for generations. So I'm an outsider being raised by a single mother. That's just mind-boggling to them, a single mother. So we didn't feel welcome. And so I remember me and my sister sitting there convincing my mother, we don't need to go to church anymore. So that's what we did. We just left that way, didn't associate, but we weren't fully involved. When
Okay.
people are fully involved, there's different, depending on what, some people literally have to leave the religious community. Usually this is like a Hutterite community situation. They have to leave it by packing up a suitcase and leaving in the middle of the night, having someone from outside the community pick them up, and they just have to literally run away. That's how serious the restrictions are for people leaving. Like, it can get that bad. But for a lot of people, it's easier than that. They will feel, because the community is their whole life, they will face various discrimination or people not accepting them, or perhaps people from their childhood will turn their backs on them and only their family will speak to them. So there's different things that a person might experience, but it's not always as extreme as running away from your Hutterite community in the dead of the night.
And what about joining? Do people just sort of turn up and say, I want to join up, I want to move in"? Is there a sort of settling in time, or how much do you know about that?
So with their missions around the world, obviously people do join. Usually it seems to be from third world countries. Maybe the people are more religious than in Australia. Because the only people I know who've kind of gotten involved in religious stuff in Australia were like my parents. They were religious already, whereas the average Australian who's non-religious isn't really going to join. Whereas, you go to South America, all of these people are religious, they'll join a lot easier.
Mm.
So, yeah, they do get converts. From what I can tell, they're going to want to instruct the new convert in their ways. And they're going to want to feel that this person not only understands the Bible and God, but also understands the church and your responsibilities to the church. Because when you become a Christian, usually they do that in their early teenage years. They spend about a year getting specific instruction on how to be a good Christian and also, the roles and responsibilities expected by the church.
Okay. And I mean, they're obviously missionaries are trying to get people to join, but I imagine, like you say, they won't just let anyone join. There's a kind of signing up process, there's a course of some kind to instruct, but then also to test the person as you're instructing. You have to make sure that they're the right sort of person who's going to join. Um, so I guess you have a pretty tough job to do that when you're trying to recruit people, but then you also have very high standards where they have to live by these rules
Yeah.
that are much more restrictive than most other sort of regimes on Earth.
And often when Mennonites go to other countries, they're a bit American. They bring their culture and they're not thinking about what fits in that culture. So they come.
They're not Australians use barbecues then.
I mean, I think would be okay with a barbecue, but it's just they're very American. So their style of dress, for example, there are so many different types of modest clothing for a woman to wear. but they have their specific style of dress they want to wear. Indian women wearing saris, they can look modest, but the Mennonites tend to bring their interpretation of modest from America and want you to do that rather than having the people dress modestly but looking like their own culture.
Sorry, I keep trying to unmute. Do you know what LARPing means? LARP.
People do that with medieval stuff, don't they?
Yeah. So LARPing literally means live action role playing, which is just you say sort of just role playing, being medieval, being a wizard or an elf or whatever it is. Actually going out in the woods and pretending with your friends that you're trying to kill each other and you're in some kind of ancient battle with possibly with magic. But LARPing has taken on a definition sort of wider than that to include people who are pretending to live a certain lifestyle inauthentically. So dressing a certain way, speaking a certain way, and pretending this is who they are when really they've only adopted this lifestyle sort of 6 months ago, and it's all a kind of show. Have you ever heard of LARPing uses that in that kind of context?
Yeah, I think that's the more modern definition of LARPing, isn't it?
No, it's kind of emerged in the last few years, and something that kind of happened. It was used only sort of derogatory for quite a while, where you'd say that someone was, if you're an American and you, why do I have to choose this example because it's definitely going to get censored on YouTube. But if you want to, I'm just going to go with it. If you're a certain very edgy kind of person, you might like to LARP to present yourself as a mid-century German of a certain party. So you might buy the merchandise, or might wear the clothes and put the certain symbol in your screen names and stuff like that, and say certain catchphrases associated with that regime, just to kind of carry like you believe this thing so much that you want every part of your life to reflect it. And I think there's something much more recently it's become, I think, a little bit more legitimate to do that. Not in that specific example, but for instance, there's the kind of something we talk about on this show a lot on Wamen Hour is like the trad wife LARP, where women who are completely brought up on feminism and television, and they have a further education degree, and they suddenly at some point in their life decide that they want to get married, have children, stay at home and be mothers and homeschool, and they're going to wear the dresses and they're going to cook their own.
So I think you've just muted yourself.
Thank you. How long have I been muted? I don't know how
just
I did that.
A few seconds.
Okay. So
they're wearing trad wife dresses, and
so the thing about the LARP is that if it comes from a good place and it's genuine, and if your heart is in the right place and it's a good thing to do, like if you're taking on good habits and good aesthetic choices, then there's a certain point where LARPing becomes a kind of legitimate lifestyle, where even though there's some level of pretense about it, it can still be a good thing for your life and for the wider community. And when you're talking about these Amish communities where they don't just demand that you dress modestly, they want you to dress Amish, right? They want you to look like a pilgrim from like the American original American settlers. So that to me like just triggers like it's a LARP, like the weird thing is that they're not LARPing as Middle Eastern desert dwelling people like Jesus and his disciples, but they're like, when did this one aesthetic choice, like I don't know, the pilgrims are associated with wearing black and like the big hats with the buckles on, and I don't know how historically accurate that is, but how did this one way of living and aesthetic choice get like frozen in time as this is how we're going to do things from now on?
Yes, their fashion style is fresh off the Mayflower, I think. But I get the impression from what I have read is that, especially I think it was the 60s, because in the whole world in general, in the Western countries, there was so much drastic change happening around then, and these people are non-resistant, so they're being drafted off to world wars, which they are not interested in fighting in. So I think a lot of the stuff kind of solidified around then. Probably not so much for the Amish, they probably stayed behind, but then the Mennonites advanced to the 60s, and then they kind of stopped there, because when you are that man just looks a bit wild.
Sorry, I
But
thought
when
just to discuss what we're talking about, I thought I'd just
yeah,
put it on the screen so that everyone knows, even if this isn't accurate, this is like
yeah.
this is what most people think of as Amish, I think.
So, yeah, I mean, I think he kind of has the general look, not the wild eyes, though, but fortunately. But yeah, if you're reading Mennonite stuff, and I realized this a while ago, they're talking as if they're still in the 60s. The main evils of the world that they will bring up and mention are stuff that was like from the 60s. They're not in the present day knowing all about present day evils. It's like the 60s was when they stopped associating with, this is more conservative Mennonites, obviously, because there's many different types of Mennonites, range from very conservative to so liberal you can't tell, or you wonder if they even are Mennonite. But with the more conservative types, it's like it was in the 60s when they really solidified a lot of their stuff, because the world was changing, TVs are a thing. Like
Hmm.
before computers and TVs and everything, people didn't have to have standards based on them. But then
Yeah,
when they start coming into the home and people are like, is this a bad influence in our children? What is this filth? Then they need to start making standards. So that's just the impression I've gotten. It was somewhere around the 60s that they came to heads with the modern age.
but they don't all
And
dress like they're from the 60s. So is it a lot like they're all dressing old fashioned, or they just using old fashioned methods so the clothes come out looking old fashioned?
their styles would have changed. I don't think you look at a conservative Mennonite woman today and she looks exactly the same as 5 generations ago.
Okay.
Because, they, like an Amish woman is wearing cotton drill in a plain color. You could probably take a picture of an Amish woman today, make it black and white, and she will look like her great 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 grandmother. But with the Mennonites, they've kind of changed over time. Like they will wear modern fabrics that weren't available back then, for example.
Are they still making their own clothes? Is that a
Yeah.
but Mennonites are just completely immersed in sort of modern economy, even if not in the culture?
Yeah. So, like the Mennonites I knew of growing up, they had like dairy farms, or the ones in Tasmania they call it a truck patch, but basically it's small a small farm, but you grow vegetables on it and you sell them at market stall type places. So like a hobby farm, but it's gardening,
Yeah, like a farmer's
producing.
market
Yeah,
stall.
that
Yeah.
yeah, that
Okay.
kind of
Yeah.
thing. So they
So
are definitely associated with the world. Yeah.
okay. So let me tell you what I if I was in charge and I could if I could start a thing, I would want, because being a parent and living in modern society, I really really enjoy YouTube and Twitter and video games and movies. But on some level, I do acknowledge that those things aren't good for me, and I think I had this notion that if I lived 600 years ago and the only form of entertainment was playing music, singing songs, even if I couldn't read, right? A lot of people were illiterate back then, before the sort of Gutenberg press. I kind of get this impression that I probably would be actually happier than I am now, even though the forms of entertainment are much more simple, and just because the fabric of the community, I imagine, is a lot stronger, and because there's not this sort of corrupting influence of all of these celebrities on TV and looking at uh, hot women online and all of these forms of entertainment, it's just so much noise and light and distraction, when really the things that I think make people actually happy and have good lives are just the people around them. And making your own bread is better than buying it in the supermarket, and make your own clothes and all of this. And that may be completely misguided. I completely am on board with that. But I guess I just wanted to talk to you about, I it would be better, I feel, to have never been corrupted by those things to begin with, because once they exist, they're so tempting that you kind of can't give them up, which is, I think, why I can kind of envisage a lot of people sort of wanting to live in a community where they can at least raise their children without all these things. And maybe it would maybe there would be TV and movies. We wouldn't go quite that far back, but things like birth control and social media, just pornography, a lot of the really recent things. I know birth control isn't that recent, but you know, mood. What am I saying? SSRIs, antidepressant drugs, and the obviously like the modern schooling system. There are a lot of people who want to detach themselves from the world. And often they do it on their own. They'll just go and homeschool their own kids. But at some point, your children have to grow up and enter the world. They have to meet other people. They're going to want to get married and have their own kids one day. They want to have friends. They're going to need to make a living. And so, this idea of a community, whatever the specific rules are, there'll probably be a lot of discussion about whether anime is allowed or whatever. Can we keep video games and all of that kind of thing? But it's a really attractive idea, and I can see why it's sprung up in a few different ways. I guess I want to ask you: Do you think I'm being too idealistic? Am I being, you know, disillusioned? What do you think about that?
I mean, you could have modern people who've experienced things, become more simple and traditional. It certainly is possible. But they would definitely have to do work on themselves because, I mean, people can want something, but then they have to put the hard work in to achieve it. Like, I think if you were in some kind of religious community setting, you could have, let's say, a room somewhere that's the computer room. People can't have the internet in their homes. They have to go there to access it. As soon as you do that, so much of people's use would just drop because they just don't, it's just not readily available. So there are methods for you to live with modern technology and not have it control everything. So I don't think what you're saying is idealistic at all. It is possible, but people need to realize that they need to, working on yourself is hard. It can be tough. So people have to realize what they're giving up and be happy to do that. And then I think it is possible.
The reason I wanted to know about just the nitty gritty stuff, like who's in charge and how do they relate to the outer economy and the laws and everything, is that it seems like it's a people talk about joining a cult, right? As a really, really bad thing to happen, because you get these people who end up being in control of these communities who go on a power trip, or they like being in charge, and they will take the opportunity to have be tyrannical about it. They end up being corrupted or biased towards this or that, and it becomes less about the idea of what the whole community was for, and more about this this person's power trip, finally getting to be in charge of all these people. Or I kind of like your idea of having God choose the final candidate between the last three, because because the randomness of it does seem the idea of it. There's something appealing about that, right? Like this, tyrants might not be able to get to the top so easily.
I've not really noticed a community go from about religion and about that lifestyle to completely the opposite. I've certainly observed I observed a community taken over, but it wasn't a departure from the lifestyle. It was just someone
Yeah.
wanting
Well,
to.
you can always use. I mean, Christianity and all religions have been used as a tool to implement whatever it is the will of the person in power. They'll just use their religion or the religion of the people as a wedge to drive whatever it is they want. So, something like Henry VIII converted to Protestantism very conveniently so that he could get divorced. It was like, it was just that, it was just that self-interested and shallow. To go like, okay, well, actually, I've suddenly decided that Protestantism is a lot better than Catholicism, and we're going to do a new thing now. So even though you're saying we're changing the religion, but actually you're saying, oh no, Protestantism is the real, true form of Christianity. It's the Catholics who have taken this to, that everyone's too many stained glass windows and statues, and you wasting all this money on things of earthly, I don't know. You can probably do this religious stuff better than I can. The point is that there's always a justification. You can, if the ruling paradigm of the community is Christianity or a certain sect of Christianity, a certain sub-ideology of Christianity, you can always find a way to use that to justify whatever it is you want to do, or find a way to justify it. I don't know if you know about Waco and David Koresh in America.
I don't know.
So they weren't Amish or Mennonite, but there's I can't remember exactly what it's called. I only watched one documentary about it, so I'm really not an expert, and I have no idea how biased this documentary was. Sorry, it wasn't even a documentary; it was a dramatized TV show depicting the events, and it's called the TV show was called Waco. Maybe it was a film. I'm really not doing well with this, but David Koresh was the leader of this Christian sect of people who lived out in Waco in the middle of nowhere. They had like a really big house where they all lived together, and the TV show makes it look like there was a lot of really good things about living there. The community, the just the love. Then also they showed us a few scenes of David Koresh using his influence. He was so powerful within that community that no one could really go against him, and he was the show, it shows him taking this guy's wife as a taking her away as if they're going to have sex in private, and no one could really speak against him or say like, hey, what are you doing in there with that guy's wife? That's not that's really not cool, that's not Christian. But because he's in charge and he gets to decide what is Christian, then
with most traditional setups, Amish, Hutterites, and Mennonites, they all have numerous people in charge. Like a bishop is in charge of, let's say, 5 churches. And within each individual church, there's 3 to 4 ministers and the deacon as well. I think, as far as I thought, I heard my mother tell me once that they do that specifically to prevent that kind of thing. You don't want one person in charge and everyone thinking they're the greatest. So when you have multiple people, there's multiple opinions, especially with, let's say, 3 ministers. 2 of them are going to have a easier time forming a gang than 3, and especially if there's 4, Just because there is multiple people in charge, I think some of that kind of stuff is just a lot harder to get away with. And because, as I said, the bishop is the bishop of 5 churches, none of these churches tend to be just singular individual things. They're, your cousin is at the church down the road. So if your minister does something weird, that you can go to that church, or your cousin will find out and will start gossiping. Because it's more that it's not like what you're describing is some kind of one secretive cult where no one has anything to do with the outside world or restricted or whatever. It's a lot easier to do cult-like stuff than if you're in, the kind of situation that Mennonites and so on are in.
Yeah, one of the definitions I've heard of cults, to make a cult different from a sect, there's a few differences, but I've heard cults described as any community, especially a religious one, where they encourage or mandate that you must cut off any contact with people who are not in the cult. So Scientologists aren't allowed to be, they aren't allowed to be friends with anyone who wants them to stop being a Scientologist. So they can still interact with people outside of Scientology, but anyone who's trying to say I don't like Scientology, you shouldn't be a Scientologist. They're not allowed to be friends with that person, because they're a bad influence, and that makes it a cult because it punishes going outside outside of the cult in that way. But the rest of what I wanted to say about Waco is that's only kind of the beginning of what Waco, like, this community was. But what happened, and this is a whole other discussion, but what happened is that they broke a firearms law. No one was killed, no one was hurt, but they didn't have the correct permit for the kind of firearms that they had in this community. And when the law enforcement tried to get involved with confiscating the firearms, or anyway, in any way sort of coming in there to enforce the law of the United States or the law of the state, the people in this community started to arm themselves. They started to, basically just defend their sort of castle doctrine, defend their own community, and said, well, you don't have any authority here, and if any police try to come in, we're going to kill them. And it became this massive firefight between the police and the I really wish I could remember. They had like a catchy, like, Latter-day Saints type name. They had a name like that they were. Can't remember it. It's really frustrating. And they basically there was this one infraction of the law was used as a justification to completely annihilate this group, and it ended up being a complete disaster where the building that they were all in burnt and some people died. And it all started with this one permit infraction, but it just escalated because the United States couldn't bear having this community within the United States not following United States law, right? And you could say that they, maybe they should have obeyed the law, and maybe they shouldn't have killed police officers, and that's definitely a good argument. But also, there's a question of how much the law was just an excuse. The breaking of the law was just an excuse to shut down this community, who were the local enforcement just didn't like them doing that. Just being there, doing their own thing. Like, there's this argument that keeps going on about whether, like, can you just be left alone in this modern world? Will the government just let you be on your own and do your own thing and log out? Even if you pay your taxes, they're just going to find you because they can't tolerate people who don't live by the homogeneous society sort of standards. Is there any, like, have you witnessed or do you know of anything like that happening where any of these communities go against the law of the land and have to dissolve or something?
From my experience, I've never met a community dissolve over something illegal. There's a Bible verse that says something like, render unto Caesar that which is Caesar's. And another quote popular in the communities, you're living in the world, but you're not of the world. So the idea is, as long as the government isn't asking you to do something against your faith, you should do it. So if it's required for the Amish to pay the taxes, they will. If they need to put their guns in a safe, they will. So, like, the name you're saying, Waco, was it? That does not
Waco, yeah.
sound familiar to me, but I do know of a few weird cults out there in the world. You hear stories occasionally. But because they did something actually illegal, something that, if it's a firearm incident, I mean, I don't know what the firearm incident is, but does that were they doing that because because the Bible required it of them?
I believe not, no.
It's there, so it wouldn't really happen in an Amish or Mennonite Hutterite situation because, they follow the law. They were conscientious objectors during World War II, so you can read some horrific stories of, basically the army beating them up or killing them because they refused to go off to war, because that's literally asking too much of them. But for a lot of these religious groups, the government was like, okay, you're refusing to fight, but we're going to get you to do this job or that job, and they're like, okay, it's not direct combat, so I'll do it.
Hmm.
So I just think with their mentality that as long as you're not being asked to do something against the Bible, against God, against your conscience, then you do it. So,
Well, how about this?
yeah.
Did you know that I don't know which countries what the law is exactly, but I believe what they call conversion therapy is illegal in in many states of America, United States, where a young person or anyone, they either voluntarily or involuntarily are being encouraged to no longer be homosexual because your community probably values family. They want the girls to marry boys and to create families, and it's they could be encouraging they could be discouraging homosexuality in their children, in the members of their community, and that could be considered conversion therapy, especially if it was a regular kind of psychological treatment, some kind of counseling sessions, or something they could point to that would say it was conversion therapy. And that sort of law is it's only getting stronger. I won't go into all the details now, but I'm sure you're aware of a lot of what's going on in the culture, and there's sort of less and less room for what I'd say, like what I'd call like traditional um, values. So it's fine if you want to get married and you want to have kids. No one's actually stopping you from doing that. You can even homeschool your own kids. But the minute that you try to encourage that behavior in someone else or discourage what some people call degenerate behavior, that becomes intolerable to it's becoming more what's the word I'm looking for? It's becoming more legally difficult ground in a lot of sort of Western countries, in England, in the United States, where that kind of stuff really could get you in trouble with the authorities, and you might need to start. What if the Amish have to start doing gay weddings, right? I'm sure they wouldn't be like too pleased with that.
Yeah, I don't think there's any gay weddings happening anytime soon. But I think, like with these religious groups, they have very strict standards for one's sexuality. So, I mean, I think you would have to really be gay or really be some kind of degenerate in order to go against it because you've been trained from birth to be in control of yourself. So, like, the world now is very permissive. So, if someone wants to experiment or try things out, then they do. But with the Amish, it's very strict and tight laced and everything. So, firstly, the number of people who would need gay conversion therapy is going to be way lower than
Well, hold
general
your horses
society.
there, because I've heard that people are born that way. Sorry, I just have to say that for the for the censors watching. You either are gay or you aren't. There's no socializing into it.
So I'm
Apparently,
speaking more generally, not just about
yeah.
being homosexual, but I mean, what people these days want to become polyamorous, let's say,
Mm.
or that kind of thing. I'm speaking more broadly about everything rather than specific homosexuality.
Yeah, anything outside of the heteronormative marriage
Yeah.
family paradigm.
Yeah. So I think the amount of people who that the church or the family would want to be counseled would be very low, just because you're brought up in an environment where you probably don't even know half of that stuff exists. Because my journey away from this religious stuff has been one horror after another, realizing that what people get up to. I remember the first time I found out numerous people could engage in sexual activity at the same time with each other. I don't remember. I think I was quite horrified and grossed out that that was a thing. So when people are brought up in that environment, they don't know half of this kind of stuff is a thing. Obviously, if you're gay, you would know how you feel, but a lot of the other offshoots of degeneracy,
Mm.
you can't really do something if you or feel a certain way if you're just not aware it exists. And
Yeah,
the other thing about these groups, they're not all over social media and everything. They're not posting their personal lives online and everything. So, and of course, they're a small subgroup of people as well. So the visibility on their gay conversion practices, I just think is very, very low. Plus, I always
yeah.
wondered if if there's cancelling about gay conversion, it's always for a purpose. I don't know if it's a political purpose for the government or if it's one particular group or a particular person has a reason for going after someone. And if the Amish are just outside of all of society, you really need a specific reason to go digging. And I do also think that it's very likely a lot of these religious groups, the people will just clam up. No, you're not speaking to our
They
kids.
can't get
We don't
evidence
know
for
anything. Yeah.
Yeah.
So there's numerous reasons. I just think Amish would be cancelled, or Mennonites, whoever they are, will be cancelled last.
I guess I'm just not so confident. We'll see, of course. I hope that they do continue to have the freedom to live the way that they want. But increasingly, it's being seen as tyrannical that to parent a child in a restrictive environment like that is seen as abusive almost. That's like abusive parenting. And as soon as that kind of abuse becomes illegal, I think these communities may start having a problem. It's kind of a question of like, how far is this woke going to go? Like, is there really no way you can hide from it without leaving the country?
I mean, things
right?
like child sex abuse is illegal. We all know it's happening in unfortunately large numbers. So and
It happens,
stuff isn't reported and all that. So if you, I mean, I just think a lot of these people online on Twitter, the feverish people busily out there cancelling and stuff. I mean, do they? I go around and I have to say Amish because no one knows what a Mennonite is. How do they know about the existence of these people, least of all what they believe or even what country they're in or where they're from, you know?
Yeah, okay. Because have to keep them secret. No one knows about them. So that I just to return to that sort of the Amish gay wedding problem. I want to know if you're in an Amish community, just off your own experience, if you for whatever reason did not want to marry at all and just wanted to live as a single bachelor, spinster, whatever, is that permitted, or do they encourage coupling, marriage?
They would encourage marriage and most people marry, but if you are going to be celibate, then I don't, as far as I'm aware, they won't try and force you. Because occasionally you do come across what you would call a bachelor in a Mennonite circle. Usually it's a man who's just turned 30. But yeah, it's like it's rare, but it does, like, there are people who just don't marry men or women. And yeah, they do expect the people to be celibate and etc.
Yeah.
But you're not going to be dragged to the altar by your collar, marry this person or else it's not.
In that, regarding that question, I know that there's a lot of mythology, I'm going to call it, around Mormons. Obviously not the same thing, but there's Mormons have their own communities. They have their own sort of state in the United States to some degree, and they do they tend to live among each other. And there are sort of rumors of people who've converted out of Mormonism telling stories of what it was like to live there, and there's some pretty crazy stuff going on. And it sounds like these good-looking teenagers aren't quite as celibate as their parents would like them to be, and it does, it gets them into trouble. And I do wonder, sort of looking historically, if you looking as far back as Shakespeare's plays, there was a lot going on with teenagers were getting up to more than they should have been by the standards of that society. And there's an element to this, what you call, under the umbrella of degeneracy, where what happens behind closed doors with nobody's knowledge, sort of like what you were saying about the Amish, in and of themselves, but the same could be said the other way, where you can get up to whatever you want as long as nobody finds out about it, because the people finding out about it is like that is the actual crime, is that you're influencing the community, if that makes sense. So as long as degenerate things happen in secret, they're not as bad as if you're flaunting them, let's say. If you're proud of them, if you're like talking about it, if you're taking photos of it or uploading videos of it to the internet, that becomes much worse than if you'd done it secretly and then you're the only one who's, to use religious terminology, you're the one who's sinning. But to spread it around is much worse. So I guess I'm asking, do you think a lot of this, not a lot of this stuff, but do you think that these the kids growing up in these communities may not be quite so celibate as they should be, but they are much better at hiding it from their parents? Or how much really can you hide from each other when you live in a community like that, do you think?
I think I heard of one story, vague whispers, of course, of an incest and an abortion. But basically, I mean, the Mennonite idea is not just if you're spreading it around, it's bad. Mennonites would hold the idea that how you behave in secret is going to come out. How you
Yeah.
behave in secret matters. So yeah, I mean, I know it's the modern day thing. If these people are in their bedroom doing their thing, leave them
Well,
to it.
that's not very.
That's
That's like the '80s thing. Now
yeah,
it's like
in
you have to
public too.
celebrate it.
Yeah, but they don't have that at all. You should be living a godly life in private as in public. I do think young people do get up to tricks, but I think once again, the opportunities to do so, especially with with Mennonites, they keep boys and girls separate a lot, especially when they're into their teenage years. Um, the courtship process is very supervised by friends and family. I just think, if you surveyed 100 teenagers, I would suggest a great deal of them would be marrying as virgins.
That's
I just, there's all kinds of things happening with some people, but the opportunities, the lifestyle being supervised so much.
yeah. Okay. We've been going for an hour now, which is usually the length of Wham an hour. So I've got a lot of really useful information from that, and I think a lot of listeners will be interested to hear about everything that we've just talked about. But is there anything else you wanted to introduce into the discussion? Anything to bring up?
If you want some interesting research,
Okay.
look into Gloria Vale. It's a community in New Zealand. It was started, I think it was only started in the 80s. It's not associated, it's its own unique religious community. It's not associated with under any broader group at all. I just think it's a really interesting thing, and there's a lot of people who've left the community who are trying to get justice for what went on there. So I just think, like, if anyone was interested, check it out.
Oh, well, yeah.
Raise awareness about it, because they when someone leaves the community, like, you literally have to throw out a photo with that person in it. Like, you can have nothing to do with them anymore forever. Like, they are dead. Even you have to do that to your child if he or she leaves. Get rid of half the family pictures. Never say their name again. And there was another horrific situation where there was a Down syndrome girl, and these people are afraid of disease, so they have this whole quarantine building. And they put her in the quarantine building, and they took the door handles off so she couldn't get out. So the poor girl is eating her dinner and she starts to choke. People can't get to her right away, and she died. So her parents have issue with this. But of course, the community, it's not our fault, don't care kind of thing. And they continue to live on the community because they have absolutely nothing. When you go to that community, you don't have your own money. And the people born on the community, they never have anything of their own. They don't have licenses. They don't have their own bank accounts. They don't, in that community, they tell you what you do with your life, regardless of whether or not you have skill or talent. So these people, they have literally nothing, and they're 40 years old. They don't have a life of independence or anything. So basically, this couple is living in a shed, a freezing cold shed, because New Zealand's a cold place, on the edge of the community, and they can't leave, but they can't be part of the community. It's really, really terrible. But basically, yes, there's a whole bunch of people who left Gloria Vale who are trying to basically bring the community to court and sue them for various shades of abuse. I believe their leader went to prison for, it was either child sex abuse or raping adult women, and half of them went and supported him anyway. So it's really it's a bit cultish, that place. But my mum almost took me there. That's the thing. She almost brought me to that place, which now I'm very glad that I went nowhere near it.
Yeah. Yeah. Also, it's not like bad things don't happen outside on the rest of the world, though. No, that is a very grim picture. I don't want to joke about it. That's very serious. Um, and if I want to put in the description of the video, I'll put the last time you were on the show, and also the video you sent me on your own channel about your experiences.
Yeah.
I'll link to that. Is there anything else you want me to link to? Anything you've done, written, been on?
Um, I haven't appeared other than on your channel, so I'm not popular.
Well, you should. You should be more popular. You've seen it here first, folks.
Well, maybe link to Gloria Vale. I can dig something
Yeah.
up
Okay.
and
Yeah.
send it
All
to
right.
you.
Yeah. Send me a link, and I'll put that in the description. That does sound like a. I don't want to say interesting, but that sounds like a morbid read. Yeah. Have a good night, and
Yeah.
thanks everyone for watching. Thanks again, Charlotte, for being on the being on the channel, and I'll see you all again soon. Thanks.